So 76-6 is an extremely interesting case in its own right, but also how it relates to the last case we are talking about, and also because it represents a kind of a unique event or occurrence in the history of the NSBE Code of Ethics. Obviously, it has to do with the ethics of basically giving bribes to foreign officials in order to secure work. And the question is whether it's ethical to do that. Um, they refer to one of the things that just makes it really interesting in terms of the history of the code is that they acknowledge that the code changed for a few years in the 60s. Uh, right. Sometime in the 60s and then continuing to 1968, there was a so called when in Rome clause that was added to the NSP Code of Ethics, which basically suspended the barring of giving these sort of gifts that were meant to influence the award of contracts when you're in foreign countries where that's just how they do business. It was a very pragmatic loosening of the code that obviously there was a lot of pressure to do this on the part of engineers who or companies that practice overseas to loosen up ethics rules in those places where the ethics are very different. You know, there's no names here about the specific country involved, and it doesn't have to be. There's plenty of countries in the world where, in order to get government contracts, you simply have to give gifts to substantial gifts to government officials and others. Obviously, there are places in America where that's true too, except that it is officially against the law and frowned upon. And but there are places where it's more ingrained and accepted and not shocking. And so there was this clause, this one in Rome clause, that recognized a sort of pragmatic, they thought, necessity for a while to loosen the restriction on giving of gifts when operating in countries where that was necessary, basically, to do business. And they stopped that. They got rid of it. In 1968, they rescinded it. And maybe it's a good research project to sort of see how it got put in the code, why it got taken out. Well, there's a very, I mean, they give the ethical reasons why it was taken out. They believe that, however pragmatically valuable it may be to have license to basically give bribes when you're working in countries where that's a necessity, basically, for doing business, that the moral cost of that, the ethical cost of that, in terms of not only the public face of the profession in America, but also the integrity of the profession itself, is just too great. For instance, here, let's see, this is a good paragraph here. Even though the practice may be legal and accepted in the foreign country, and even though some might argue on pragmatic grounds that United States commercial companies should go along to protect the jobs of employees in this country, we cannot accept it for professional services. No amount of rationalization or explanation will change the public reaction that the profession's claim of placing service before profit has been compromised by a practice which is repugnant to the basic principles of ethical behavior under the laws and customs of this country. That is, the cost is just too great in terms of the standing of the profession. Any profession, including, as you know, engineering, the very idea of the profession is that it puts service above profit. So if it's willing to compromise its ethical principles for the sake of profit, that sort of pulls the rug out from under that whole claim. It's not worth it. They go on and say, even if the go-along philosophy is accepted as an exception only for foreign work, the result must be a chipping away of ethical standards, leading to contention that such conduct should also be accepted in the United States when and if it is argued that such is the local or area practice. It's a slippery slope, basically, they say. I mean, if the NSPE is willing to countenance bribery in Indonesia or India or France or Canada, whatever it is, then that's one step away from saying, well, if it's the cost of doing business in France or Canada, then, well, the reality is it's the cost of doing business in Philadelphia in many cases, right? Considering the history of the city's corruption. And Philadelphia is not unique and not even the worst American place. I mean, there's other places in Pennsylvania that are probably more corrupt than Philadelphia, and there's other cities in the country. What did Lenny Bruce say about Chicago? It's so corrupt, it's thrilling. I mean, once you make an exception for a foreign country, you're one step away from making an exception for an American locality that's particularly corrupt. And then you're one step away from saying, what the hell, just do whatever you want. So they just draw the line, Well, what's the argument? I mean, but then the argument is, well, what are we going to do? I mean, if we can't get work there unless we bribe people, then we've got to bribe people, right? And they say that, no, that's a fallacy. They say here at the end, this approach is not dissimilar to the arguments advanced by those who have so recently been revealed as offering financial payments to public officials to influence the award of contracts for architect engineer services. The rationale was, quote, we had no choice. Others were doing it, and if we did not, we would not be considered. The short answer is that there is a choice, the choice of declining to be drawn into a seamy procedure for self-gain. That is, you have a choice, and that is to turn, to realize that you can't do, you have to turn down the work. I mean, if you accept a job of any sort that undermines your basic ethical principles, you've undermined your basic ethical principles, and you can't go back. Right? So there is a choice. The choice is don't take the work. Don't deal with people who are dishonest. Don't break the code. And maybe that's to some people's minds unreasonable, but it's probably the only way to keep this whole thing from being a farce. Right? What we've been doing here for the past 4 weeks is basically being guided by the NSPE Code of Ethics and the board that's tasked with applying it to specific cases. If it turns out that we're willing to throw the whole thing away for profit, then that means it was a charade and it wasn't worth studying in the first place. So it's an extremely interesting case. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. I don't know what it's like to run a business, and I don't know what it's like to deal with corrupt government officials, and I don't know what it's like to sort of make hard decisions about ethics versus profit. But I think that the Board of Ethical Review is pretty clear on this. You can't throw your ethics under the bus for profit. And if you're in violation of the NSPE code, you're in violation. And there's the rationalization that we had to do it, or I had to do it because that's the way it's done, and that argument just doesn't really hold any water as far as they're concerned.